frankly, we've been watching the oil prices over the last year or so, I think from the region in particular, with great trepidation. And it was interesting to me that in all the interviews that I've done with OPEC ministers over the last year or so, for so long they were denying any ability of geopolitical events to influence the price. They just wouldn't go there. You'd push them there and they just kind of wiggle around and they wouldn't actually say it. But over the last couple of months, they're definitely saying that the volatility in the market, a lot of it has to do, of course, with geopolitics. They're right there. They're putting it out there. And I think it's really interesting is when I had this chance to sit down exclusively with the Deputy Secretary of Energy from the United States, he was sitting pretty. Let's listen into what he had to say.
Not at all. It's great for the market. The Middle East obviously has produced oil for many, many years. They're great competitors, if you will, to the United States. But U.S. production is growing up by leaps and bounds and will continue for the foreseeable future. As far as we can tell, EIA tells us that U.S. production will continue to increase probably for the next 20 years. If that's true, then our energy future, I should say, is absolutely secure. So we're really excited about what that means, not only to our national security, but to our economic security as well.
One of the conversations that I have on and off again with these OPEC member countries, whether it be the UAE's energy minister or the Saudi energy minister as well, is about the concerns over market volatility. And what they've told me is that they have reached out to the shale producers. They've had really good conversations with them so far about how they have to work together to balance the market. Where does the U.S. government stand there? Because there's a lot of concern on Capitol Hill, and even with the president at this point, about OPEC being bad for the market.
Well, it's important to understand that as a U.S. government, we don't have a policy of setting market prices. So we're fundamentally different in that regard from OPEC or any other country that may have state-owned or state-operated oil and gas companies. So we're just fundamentally different in that regard. So as we look at energy policy, our goal is to increase production and let the market decide what prices will be. So price stability to us, it matters only to the extent that consumers are protected from price spikes, I should say, from around the world. And that typically comes from cartel-type activity. So we're concerned about it in that regard, but it's important to understand that we're just so fundamentally different than many of these other countries.
Is there a role to potentially facilitate those kinds of conversations between the shale oil industry and external producers like OPEC and OPEC Plus? Because at the end of the day, depending on the oil price, shale producers can be helped or hurt, and that's a job situation for the United States.
Sure, I think it's important that these two different industries talk from time to time, but not for the purposes of setting prices. Again, go back to that fundamental point. We do not approach the marketplace that way, and it's very important that we recognize that. So to the extent that they're trading technology, they're looking at best practices, they're looking at ways to make themselves more efficient, more productive, we say by all means, and we encourage those conversations, but never for the purposes of setting market prices.
Does the concern then lie with the potential rhetoric that we hear from the White House or from those on Capitol Hill when they're attacking cartels, as you call them, OPEC, OPEC Plus, on prices? Because that, of course, can mean volatility in the market.
Sure. I think with regard to OPEC, with regard to OPEC Plus, I think it's important for us to recognize that they're much less influential than they were perhaps, say, 25 or 30 years ago. And it's important to address that in a very measured and even approach. So perhaps the rhetoric can get heated at time, from time to time on both sides. And we've seen this with the Russians. We've seen this with, some in the Middle East. We've seen this in times from our own government, depending on the time frame. I remember very well back in 1973, I was old enough to remember those gas lines. Our rhetoric got a bit heated at that point in time as well. I think we have to approach these issues in a very measured tone and a very measured approach. But again, I'll go back to that fundamental point. We are so different than any other country with regard to our energy production. Our future is so bright with regard to our production numbers, and we're very excited about that.
I don't know if you heard him, Jemana, but he used that dirty word. He called them a cartel. And also, of course, sitting pretty in terms of the U.S. energy situation, a lot of positivity there in terms of what that energy independence will mean for the United States, whether it be economically or, of course, security-wise as well. But I thought it was interesting that he basically said, OPEC they're not as relevant as they used to be. And, of course, that's something that we've heard again and again over the last couple of years in particular. And, of course, one of the big questions going forward is whether or not they will actually work behind the scenes to continue to facilitate those conversations. Because speaking to energy ministers in the region, the oil ministers from Saudi Arabia, from Oman, as well as from the UAE, it's been made pretty clear to me that they're very open to having continued dialogue with the shale oil producers because at the end of the day, they're trying to balance the market.
Hey everybody, it's Hadley Gamble from our new CNBC Middle East Bureau in Abu Dhabi. Thanks for stopping by. Now to watch more, you can try one of the videos that just popped up on your screen. And don't forget to subscribe.